Video 1. The importance of justice. Justice is the great legitimizer. It is what distinguishes a true leader from a tyrant. Any society, no matter how ideal, will have its share of dysfunctional individuals. These people will seek to further their own ends, their own power, at the expense of others and ultimately at the expense of the nation. If left to their own devices, they will cause the fall of any nation. Thus, let us examine the topic of justice. Why is justice important? What should be considered a crime? And what kind of punishment is appropriate? This will be important in the times to come as governing bodies and law enforcement agencies become less and less interested in actually defending justice and more interested in defending their own powers. Why is justice important? For a society, and thus a nation to function, the individuals comprising it must agree upon a set of rules, which we call laws. Ideally, the goal of these laws should be to facilitate and protect society by prohibiting activities harmful to it. Going against those rules would then be harming society. Though the legitimacy of certain laws in current nations is debatable, remember that we are talking about an ideal scenario for the sake of argument. Now, imagine a criminal, as in someone who works against a greater good, usually for personal gain. Instead of examining why he must be opposed, it is better to understand what would happen if he is not opposed. So, we have our criminal doing dastardly deeds. He lies, he steals, he rapes, he murders. Now, of course, the first consequence of this is that it harms society. He is harming people, and if society does not work to protect its members from harm, then it is not achieving its goals. However, being left to his own devices, his effect on society is outright perverse. First of all, many will see that there is no consequence to his actions. And seeing that society apparently does not benefit them, these other individuals will become disillusioned with the idea of the society itself, therefore causing them to also begin working for personal gain. Worse, the dysfunctional individual will often abuse people's goodwill to obtain what he needs, discouraging cooperation between these people, sowing distrust. Eventually, without the enforcement of laws, all the individuals stop trying to make the society function and simply try to take everything for themselves, causing national collapse. To a wise leader, there are also great benefits to being just. As discussed before, power only lays where men believe it lies. Power can be obtained through many ways, from faith to blackmail to violence to love to respect. And in the proper administration of justice, a leader gains a tremendous amount of love and respect and thus power. A just leader needs not use violence or fear to retain his power. So, we can determine two tenets. 1. Without justice, society collapses. 2. A proper administration of justice empowers the leaders of a nation. So, the question arises, how can justice be properly administered? To answer this, we must first understand what a crime is. To begin, let us all agree that a crime is harmful. To what or whom? It matters little. But it has to be harmful to someone or something. There is no such thing as a victimless crime, and thus any attempt at turning an activity which does no harm into a crime has no legitimacy. Note, however, that the harm of the crime needs not be direct. Certain actions are very harmful to society, yet their impact when accomplished by a single individual will be almost invisible. Second of all, we have to agree that it causes more harm than good. Any man pricking children with needles would be accused of child abuse, yet we fully understand the virtue in the medical act of vaccination. This means that any action must be put in context before being judged, so as to evaluate whether it was truly a crime. Finally, the perpetrator needs to have a degree of consciousness about his actions. This is why we do not punish children or the mentally ill as harshly. An accident and a willful action are two different things. So, we can say a crime is an action which causes harm, does not cause more good than harm, and which was done willfully. Once this is understood, how do we enforce laws, as in, how do we actually have justice? The answer is simple: prevention and punishment. Prevention aims at reducing criminality, while punishment seeks to stop its harmful impact. Prevention is a fairly complex issue which I do not feel qualified to speak about, yet let us say that there are many factors involved, including good socio-economic conditions, proper education and a strong yet just law enforcement. What I find more interesting to discuss is punishment, as I feel it is nowadays far too often done wrong. As said before, all crimes must be punished. It is essential to protect the well-being of a society. If the government or law enforcement refuse to punish crimes, then it actually becomes necessary to engage in the unsavory practice of vigilantism. This is undesirable for many reasons, including the lack of experience of the general population in dealing with crime and its punishment. Yet, if justice is not served, then honest citizens are left with no choice but to take it into their own hands. It is thus vital for law enforcement and the government to make sure that they enforce law properly. But what should be the aim when punishing? How harshly should people be punished? How is this determined? The aim, when punishing, is to make sure the punishment feels like the crime was not worth committing. It is as simple as that. This is why big crimes should receive worse punishments. However, let us look at it from a pragmatic standpoint. We have individuals here, dysfunctional yet still capable. The aim here should be to salvage them. So, while punishing the criminal, at the same time he should be evaluated, and those capable of rehabilitation should be given the chance. This does not mean that their punishment should be any less harsh, but merely that we should make sure that they do not turn to crime again once their sentence has been served. Likewise, any individual evaluated as having no potential for rehabilitation should likely never leave jail and maybe even be executed. Though I am personally against the death sentence for reasons I don't want to discuss here, my practical mind sees no reason to release someone whose first goal after their punishment is done will be to cause more harm, and I see no reason for the nation to have to maintain their continued existence. At best, they should be put to forced labor. But how do we know how harshly someone should be punished? To know, we simply go back to the definition of a crime. How harmful were the actions? And was the person aware of what they were doing? An accidental action which caused little harm should carry little or no punishment. A planned action which causes great and irreparable harm should carry the harshest punishment. The degree of harm should always be judged according to how many individuals were harmed and in what way, while the degree of responsibility should be judged according to the accused's degree of consciousness and intentions. So, we now understand that justice is important as it prevents the collapse of society and empowers its leaders. We know that a crime is a willful and harmful action which causes more harm than good. And we now understand that punishment should be tailored according to the degree of harm done and the criminal's degree of responsibility, and that we should still aim to salvage criminals through either rehabilitation or forced labor. Now that this is understood, you may finally know why it is such a tragedy that our law enforcement agencies and governments are losing interest in the actual administration of justice. And you may finally know what to do once things start collapsing. Video 2: The Dangers of Echo Chambers. The last 2 decades have seen an astounding rise in extremism everywhere in the world, including in supposedly first world nations. Not coincidentally, these decades match with the rise of the World Wide Web. This is because the internet has allowed the proliferation of a phenomenon which has become known as echo chambers. Echo chambers are a threat to the advancement of mankind through the intellectual isolation they promote. They prevent the exchange of ideas and ultimately allow tyrants to control the masses through careful cloaking of thought currents. They breed intolerance and ignorance. They are the death of the human spirit. But what is an echo chamber? To understand what it is, one must examine how they are formed. In real life, individuals must interact with one another in order for society to function. These individuals will sometimes get along, sometimes not. However, even when they get along, there are always slight differences, slight disagreements. This is easily overcome with a bit of tolerance. One can easily accept that other people will think differently, have different opinions, have different values, even if only slightly. So, despite their differences, individuals will learn to not only work together, but become friends. On the internet, things are different. You are separated from those you interact with. You can choose who you talk to, and if someone bothers you, you can ignore them with the click of a button. Unlike real life, You're not stuck with the people around you. There are billions of people on the internet, and you can pick who you want to talk to. As people are no longer forced to deal with other people's differences. They simply don't. As they don't deal with different people. They do not grow a tolerance to dealing with different people. And as internet communities are built, this means people who do not agree with the community's mainstream opinion are immediately considered undesirable and removed by community managers. Ultimately, this means the people in these communities only interact with people who think exactly like them. And as this happens, their fallacious beliefs and aberrant behaviors do not get challenged, and so they become more and more extreme. This is where the term echo chamber comes from. Members of these communities do not go there to have an actual social interaction, they go there to have their beliefs repeated to them and validated. It's a form of self-gratification and one which is dangerous to human civilization. For you see, the effect of these echo chambers is not limited to the internet. As more and more of people's social interactions take place on the internet, the effect becomes more pronounced. A man who does not tolerate dissent on the internet is unlikely to tolerate it in real life too. Though more inclined to keep their minds to themselves in real life because of the fear of retaliation, or worse, a challenge to their ideas. Their opinions of the people surrounding them still suffers. Someone who used to be that friendly coworker who has an annoying habit of squeaking his chair is suddenly that unbearable asshole you can't wait to get away from when your shift ends. The nice girl who votes Republican is suddenly a brainwashed neocon. The coworker who takes breaks to get a smoke twice a day is suddenly your worst enemy. And as this intolerance builds, so does extremism. Those with a different opinion are no longer merely different. They're enemies. And those who even dare to suggest that you might be wrong must be removed. In turn, this leads to a great reduction of the spread of ideas. As people are no longer capable of dealing with differing mindsets, trying to instill ideas in them becomes more and more difficult. This is a terrible thing in any friend of humanity, as it means a regression, a loss. It means the impossibility of teaching others about different ideas as they refuse to even consider them. Yet to tyrants, this is a dream come true. In fact, for most of history and in most of the world, including the 20th and 21st century Western nations, those who would seek to dominate have used this to keep control over their population. By misinforming them. By keeping important ideas out of their reach. By limiting their ability to connect with others, they created echo chambers. Certainly not as exclusive and extremist as those we see on the internet, yet still very influential. Influential enough that those who differed from the norm would be exiled, imprisoned or executed. Logically, the internet, through its ability to connect people, should have removed this weapon from the arsenal of the mighty. Yet, as explained, and against all odds, it has actually made it even more efficient. Even better. But how do we fight this? How do we stop this nonsense? Now do we disarm this weapon? The answer itself is discouraging. It is almost impossible to do. People are naturally inclined to seek echo chambers to seek people who validate them. In fact, those who seek conflict, even simple in the form of discussion, of opinions, are seen as mentally unstable. Yet there are ways to mitigate it. First and foremost, free speech. Any attack on legitimate free speech must be seen as an attempt to build or strengthen an echo chamber. Whether through hate speech laws, the banning of books, movies and websites, or through simple terrorism. Those who attack free speech seek to silence opposing voices and prevent the flow of ideas. These people must be fought tooth and nail. Secondly, education. We must teach our children to hear others' ideas. We must teach them about fallacies. We must teach them rational thought. We must teach them about tolerating differences, not necessarily accepting them. Merely tolerating. We must equip them with the necessary tools to break away from the echo chambers forming around them. This will not necessarily be feasible, however, as not all people are capable of learning these and using them properly. However, by teaching the greatest number of people possible about these, we can limit the damage done. Third, simply speaking out. Speak your opinions. Spread them. Do not hide them. force people to hear them. The more people do this, the more opinions people will be exposed to, and the less effective echo chambers become. Though this may be dangerous, the internet allows you to do this fairly anonymously, if you want to. Video 3: The importance of self-sufficiency. Self-sufficiency is the key to a nation's prosperity. Any nation which cannot produce its own food and other resources required for basic needs is essentially nothing but a vassal state, entirely dependent on the whims of the nation providing it with goods. To understand this, I will explain what many consider a basic concept of economy, yet which bears repeating for this discussion. The economy is divided between three sectors. 1. Primary, which is production. This sector includes farms, mines, the lumber industry, oil wells, etc. Basically, any activity which extracts resources and makes them available. 2. Secondary, which is transformation. This sector concerns itself with taking the resources and creating things with them. This is manufacturing, construction, food processing, etc. It is entirely dependent on the primary sector to function. 3. Tertiary, which is service. This sector concerns pretty much everything else, from selling to transport to healthcare to entertainment. Though not entirely, it is still extremely dependent on both the primary and secondary sectors. The tertiary sector is different from the two previous ones in that it does not actually produce any wealth. At best, it transfers wealth from one entity to the other. Now that we've established this, we can explore how self-sufficiency is crucial to any nation. To better understand, let us explore 4 different societies. The first one only has the tertiary sector. These nations actually exist, they rely entirely on tourism for subsistence. As they do not produce anything themselves, they must buy the things they need from other nations. However, they cannot do so without anything to provide in exchange, and so they rely on tourists from other nations coming to visit them and selling services to them. This allows them to obtain money, which they then exchange for the goods they need. The citizens of these nations are entirely at the mercy of the rest of the world. However, other nations may decide to raise their prices to take advantage of them, or tourism may stop, or a catastrophe might mean that other nations aren't even willing to sell to them. A nation whose economy revolves around the tertiary sector is thus at the mercy of the international economy. The second one has both the secondary and tertiary sector. Many nations nowadays have taken this model, having stopped producing their own resources and instead importing them to transform them. Such an economy is less vulnerable as it is capable of producing its own goods, yet it still depends on other nations to provide it with the resources it needs. The third one has both the primary and tertiary sector. It produces its own resources, sells them to client nations who transform them, then buys them back. Though it has some leeway against other nations, if the other nations try and swindle them through raising the prices of processed goods, as an example, it can just stop providing them with the resources they need in return. It is still dependent on other nations. Only the fourth one is self-sufficient. The nation with a primary, a secondary and a tertiary sector. Such an economy does not fear embargoes, sanctions, taxes or catastrophes in other parts of the world, as it does not depend on other nations to produce its resources and process them. Thus, any such nation cannot be bullied by others in any way except military. We can then rightfully claim that the prosperity of a nation depends on its self-sufficiency. As seen, any nation not capable of producing its own resources and transforming them is dependent on the international economy in one way or another, and thus at its mercy. However, in the last decades, we've seen the opposite. With urbanization, wealthy nations have abandoned either the primary or secondary sector, constantly placing more and more emphasis on the tertiary. The secondary sector has been almost entirely moved to less prosperous nations. Though the effect is avoidable for a while, it was inevitable. As the supposedly wealthy nations produced less and less wealth, they fell deeper and deeper into debt. Solutions have been proposed, yet what must be done remains obvious. Any nation which wishes to reverse this trend of increasingly greater dependence on the global economy must achieve these. 1. Restart the primary resource sector, food production in particular. Feeding your people is the most important objective one must meet, and as long as your nation is capable of feeding itself, you're not going to feel most methods of economic warfare. Even if you cannot produce all the resources you need, everyone needs food, and you can always trade food for fuel and materials. 2. Focus the secondary sector on processing local resources. This means your manufacturing sector is not dependent on the whims of the international economy. Only once you can process your resources yourself should you consider opening industries which process foreign resources. 3. Acquire vassal states. If a nation can become self-sufficient, it should then seek nations which cannot be and submit them. This is simple. Offer them what they need in exchange for their loyalty. One should focus on nations which can produce resources which are unavailable at home, thereby securing them. If the vassal state refuses to cooperate in the future, you can simply cut the flow of the resources they need and starve them. So, remember. Any man who speaks of replacing agriculture with industry and industry with tourism is not a friend to your nation.
Video 4. Statistics.
Sanity is not statistical. George Orwell wrote those words in 1984. Back then, the meaning of this phrase was that it does not matter how many people believe in the truth remains the truth, regardless. However, Orwell had something to say about statistics in that same book, but actually, he thought as he readjusted the Ministry of Plenty's figures, it was not even forgery. It was merely the substitution of one piece of nonsense for another. Most of the material that you were dealing with had no connection with anything in the real world, not even the kind of connection that is contained in a direct lie. Statistics were just as much a fantasy in their original version as in their rectified version. A great deal of the time you were expected to make them up out of your head. For example, the Ministry of Plenty's forecast had estimated the output of boots for the quarter at 145 million pairs. The actual output was given as 62 millions. Winston, however, in rewriting the forecast, marked the figure down to 57 millions so as to allow for the usual claim that the quota had been overfulfilled. In any case, 62 millions was no nearer the truth than 57 millions, or than 145 millions. Very likely no boots had been produced at all. Likelier still, nobody knew how many had been produced, much less cared. All one knew was that every quarter astronomical numbers of boots were produced on paper, while perhaps half the population of Oceania went barefoot. And so it was with every class of recorded fact, great or small. Everything faded away into a shadow world in which, finally, even the date of the year had become uncertain. His point here, simply put, was that one should be wary of statistics. And he was right. Statistics released by any governing body, and especially those released by interest groups, should be viewed with a strong dose of suspicion. Statistics are how reality is manipulated. Statistics are how governments and interest groups build narratives. Statistics are how they can make you say that black is white. Statistics are the embodiment of lies wearing a fresh suit of legitimacy. This may seem preposterous to some, but a mere questioning quickly shows the truth of it. How do you know statistics are truthful? Because a specific person or organization said them. Why does that make them true? Are you of those who think people would just do that? Tell lies? Well, let me tell you, they do. People who want power over you have a vested interest in lying to you, in concealing the truth, in keeping you misinformed. The less you know, the better. Or rather, the more what you know is in line with what they want you to know, the better. Of course, this does not mean all statistics are lies. In fact, it's why so many statistics exist. They bury the relevant statistics in a mountain of useless ones, and the relevant ones are the falsified ones. That way, they can keep an air of reliability while lying when it matters to them. Or better yet, they won't be lying, merely misleading. This is why, as an example, inflation rates seem to remain fairly equal to wages in the Western world, while the price of everything from housing to food has skyrocketed in the last 15 years. If someone points out this fallacy, the ones peddling this bullshit will claim that's because the price of certain goods isn't taken into account because they vary too much. All important statistics are either likewise falsified in such a way by playing with semantics or presentation, or they're outright fabricated. Does this mean statistics are pointless? Of course not. A governing body has great use for them, both to understand what decisions need to be taken and whether they're efficient or not. Crime rate statistics are useful to know whether you need better equipped police forces and where. Birth rates are important, so you know how many schools you need, how much time your population must spend parenting, to know if measures need to be taken to encourage procreation. Even a very limited and libertarian government must need statistics to know whether its army is efficient or if there's a health issue in their nation. Likewise, how acceptable is it to falsify statistics? I've spoken of propaganda before, how it is needed to simplify an issue down to a palatable level for the populace which has concerns other than grander political schemes. However, one of my points then is that propaganda must not lie. It may simplify a lot, it may dodge more profound aspects of a debate, but in the end it must tell the truth, otherwise it risks being unveiled as a lie, causing a loss of trust from the population and a great loss of effectiveness for future propaganda campaigns. So, statistics released by a responsible government should neither be misleading or false. And so remember, question, question, question. For if half the population of your nation goes barefoot, you should definitely question your government when it claims boot production has reached record levels.
Video 5. Emasculation.
The wiser among you already know I'm not speaking of literal emasculation, but figurative. There has been a movement in the last few decades to emasculate society, or more precisely, the middle and lower class. I am not merely talking about men, but about suppressing attributes which are classically considered masculine: belligerence, leadership, decisiveness, rationality, and action. Instead, their feminine counterparts have been promoted: amicability, obedience, compromising, emotionality, and passiveness. Even anger has been suppressed, as if it is an unnatural emotion and that feeling it makes you inferior. As if feeling anger towards tyrants, crooks, liars, and criminals is inappropriate. The truth of this statement is self-evident, yet some would likely demand proof of such a state of affairs, as if one would need to analyze thousands of pictures of the sky to determine that it is indeed blue. Yet one does not have to look far to find evidence, especially within Western schools, where masculine traits are almost always considered undesirable and even punished, unless a child is in an expensive private school. Even rationality is only rewarded as far as it allows people to make society function. And I need not mention the ridiculous concept of toxic masculinity, which would have merit if it hadn't been stretched to the point of encompassing all masculinity. But when did this all begin? And why is it happening? Quite simply, it all began with feminism. It was not the aim of feminism, yet its cause was hijacked by people with interest in doing so. Of course, the goal of feminism in the very beginning was not the emasculation of society. Its objective was the empowerment of women, namely promoting the idea that women had a right to vote in a democratic society, that they should have equal rights, that they should be allowed to occupy the same jobs as men, etc. If you know my opinion on democracy, rights, and equal opportunity, you'll understand why I actually see nothing wrong with the original cause of feminism. In a true democracy, there is no justification for depriving half the adult population of the right to vote. Saying otherwise is denying the very reason democracy exists, which is that in a republican government, limiting the numbers of those who can choose their leaders increases the risk of corruption immensely. What is important, however, is not what feminism wanted to achieve, or whether it was right or not. What matters is the impact it had on society, namely women entering the workforce in large numbers and getting into positions of authority. Now, whether feminine and masculine traits are inborn or learned is irrelevant, and any attempt to take the discussion in that direction is merely an attempt to derail it. What matters is that men exhibit the masculine traits and women exhibit the feminine traits. And now we're getting to the why. You see, as women entered the workforce, employers, read, the upper classes, quickly noticed the difference between the male and the female employee. In case you don't understand, review the masculine and feminine traits I listed earlier. What I mean is that female employees are more obedient, are less likely to argue with their superiors, are more likely to ask their superiors for directions when they're unsure of the course to take, are less likely to fight for better conditions and better pay, etc. Likewise, politicians made a similar observations. Female voters tend to be more emotional, they tend to favor security over rights and freedom, they're less likely to question what their government does, etc. Note that in both cases, it certainly is tens and more likely. Not all women are more emotional than rational, not all women are submissive, not all women are indecisive. Likewise, not all men are rational, not all men are belligerent, not all men are decisive. It doesn't matter, however. What matters is that women are more likely to have the feminine traits, which the upper class noticed. And to them, these traits are desirable in a lower class. It makes their employees, their citizens easier to manipulate, to control, to dominate. And so, the upper classes, under the guise of taking up the fight of social justice, changed the course of feminism. It was no longer about empowering women. No longer would feminism say women are just as good, rather, it became society must accommodate women. Then it became men need to change. And now it's quickly becoming masculinity is bad. So, what can be done? That is a question I am unable to answer. It would seem obvious to say that masculinity needs to be promoted again, that we must fight back against equal outcome and bring back actual equal opportunity, that we must announce what is being done. But how to achieve all of these? A mere sensitization campaign would immediately be shot down. I propose 3 solutions. 1. Instead of directly saying that masculinity is good, the masculine traits should be promoted in a completely neutral way, as in without mentioning feminism or gender politics or anything of the sort. Leadership, decisiveness, action, rationality and even belligerence must be shown as positive traits. 2. Attempts to demonize these traits should be shot down. Force those who do so to explain why they think it's wrong and why they think their opposite are good. Meanwhile, promote the negative aspects of the feminine traits. 3. Finally, and in my opinion the most devious, yet most entertaining solution, would be to teach our daughters to hold the masculine traits. This might seem strange, yet it would turn the emasculation of society on its head. As these girls grow into women and exhibit the masculine traits, they will quickly learn how these traits, necessary for anyone who wishes to elevate themselves in society, are constantly suppressed. As women become the victims of this campaign, the idea that opposing it is misogynistic will shatter. These solutions are certainly not perfect, and I myself see many things wrong with them, yet they're the best I can come up with. Still, we must either act to preserve our masculinity now, or watch as our children and grandchildren are raised into pseudo-slaves who do not question the upper classes and believe that they do not deserve more than what they're given.
Video 6. Propaganda.
Propaganda is not merely a useful tool, but a necessity in a functional nation. Propaganda has become a dark word associated with repression, disinformation, and totalitarianism. In fact, our governments will use this as a tool. Enemy propaganda is presented as it is, propaganda. Neutral information is also called propaganda. However, the government's propaganda will be given more pleasant names, such as journalism or public service announcements. In the end, they are all the same thing, propaganda. Yet, the idea that propaganda is necessarily a bad thing is wrong. As explained before, the leading of a nation is beyond the grasp of the common man, and not always through intellectual limitations, but sometimes merely through motivation. An individual only has so much time in his day, and depending on his situation, political activity may not be possible. The common man should not be expected to keep himself well informed on all political events. That is the duty of the politician. However, for a nation to function, the aims of its citizens must be in line with those of the leadership, and this can only be achieved if the citizens have some knowledge of political issues. This is where propaganda comes in. Good propaganda does not need to lie. In fact, it must be telling the truth. If the propaganda lies, the citizenship will find out sooner or later, and their trust in their government will be severely undermined, which in turn will make all future propaganda ineffective. No, the aim of propaganda should not be to disinform the citizenship, but to inform it. It is meant to break down complex political issues into an easy-to-understand and memorize format fit for the proletariat. Not the intelligentsia, but the proletariat. The more intelligent members of a society will be able to understand the basics of a political issue without the aid of propaganda, and so it should not be targeted to them. Hence, propaganda should aim at being simple. Simple in that it should be easy to remember. Simple in that it should not be morally ambiguous. Simple in that it should be easy to convey it quickly to as many people as possible. Once that is achieved, it must be repeated as often as possible to make sure it enters the public's consciousness. Furthermore, a government should have as few propaganda campaigns at once as possible. The more messages being sent to the populace, the less likely they are to remember any of it. In the end, if propaganda is done well, not only will it allow better management of the nation as the citizenship will be better informed of the leadership's intentions, but it will also increase general contentment as people will now understand the measures taken by their government. If it is not done well, it will sow distrust and greatly hinder the nation's potential. What is important to remember, however, is that the idea that propaganda is wrong is, itself, wrong. If our aim is to better our society and to build better nations, then we must learn to use propaganda properly. It is the only way to gain the people's approval and thus their collaboration. And only once that is achieved can change finally happen.
Video 7, The Media.
The media are the people's eyes and ears. Hence, whoever controls the media controls what the people see and hear, and therefore what they know. There's an unhealthy attitude in modern society, which is one of blind trust in news media. The source of this trust is multiple, from mere naivety to indifference, from news media which were historically reliable to confirmation bias. From the moment where they can speak and understand the world around them, citizens of the Western world are trained to believe that what the news tell them about the world is true. Worse, they are trained to believe that doubting what is said on the news is tantamount to insanity. But why? What guarantee do we have that what is said on the news and written in the papers is truthful? Who controls the quality of the content? And who controls them? In the end, we hand the mantle of guide to a pleiad of individuals who are no more trustworthy than the common man. In fact, you should consider them even less trustworthy, for, as said, whoever controls the media controls what the people know, and therefore, people with vested interest in controlling the masses will definitely do all in their power to take control of the media. And as you can guess, these people cannot be trusted. But how do they even create a semblance of legitimacy? If they were always reporting on doubtful matter, people would catch on, right? Of course they would. And that is why a large portion of what you see on the news is actually the truth. What you have to understand is that they tell you the truth about things which are irrelevant in the grander scheme of things. They'll report on car accidents, on meaningless crimes, on sports, on celebrities, on the weather. Reporting the truth on these topics helps give an air of legitimacy to news organizations, and so people are less inclined to question them when these bullshit peddlers do have an incentive to lie, as in any time political matters are involved. And this is the issue when it comes to the masses. For some reason, it has become common belief that if a man tells the truth about one thing, he will not be lying about another. As if people either say the truth or lie all the time. The fallacy in this previous statement is obvious to all, yet it is still subconsciously held by the majority of people. Thus, the key from freeing the masses from the control of the corrupt media of our times is to remind them of this fallacy. Force them to question the news whenever it is questionable. Show evidence of when the news lied. Evidence of governmental interference with news reporting. And do it impartially. Remember that the fact of the media's unreliability remains the same regardless of who controls it. Making people question the reliability of the mainstream media simply to redirect them to just as questionable alternatives will not help our cause. Finally, One very important action people must begin taking to understand what is wrong with the media is to know who controls it. The ownership of all major media corporations is public knowledge and thus available to all. By finding who owns which corporations and determining what links them together, it becomes possible to understand which group controls the media and thus who is not trustworthy. It will allow you to know who is your enemy. To understand who wants to control what you see and hear. Who wants to control what you know. Who wants to control you. Does this mean all news media should be abolished? After all, they are apparently nothing more than a tool to manipulate the masses. The truth is that either different news media organizations should be independent of each other and of their nation's power structures altogether, or they should all be under the control of the government. Which one is preferable depends on the government form. In a democratic society, independent news organizations are preferable so as to allow the public to form their own opinion. In more autocratic governments, nationalized new media are preferable so as to keep the masses unified, though as explained before, a wise leader would do well to keep his populace well informed so as to keep his nation powerful. In the end, remember these facts: the media can be used to control your view of the world and therefore control you. It is necessary to determine who controls the media in order to fight back. And news media needs to be telling the truth to the people in order to keep them informed and thus to keep the nation informed.
Video 8. Cronyism and Nepotism.
On cronyism and nepotism. Meritocracy is the only valid system. Any other is doomed to eventual failure. Such a statement might seem self-evident to many, yet many won't believe it either. These people seem to think it is possible to survive indefinitely on a system where the competent are enslaved by the incompetent. It is not so. Nature itself works this way. In order to survive and to propagate yourself, you must be able to feed yourself and protect yourself from harm. Humans may seem out of reach of the laws of nature, but they are not. Humans must still feed themselves, they must still protect themselves from harm, and all the goods and technologies you see around you had to be made by someone. None of what you see around you merely appeared at your wish. Someone had to think for it, had to put it there for you, even if that person was yourself. Keeping this in mind, we then understand that in order for society to function, people must work. They must think. They must produce. And the more people work, think and produce, the better society works. And the better society works, the more people are motivated to work, think and produce. It's a virtuous cycle where one enjoys the product of one's own labor, hence is encouraged to be productive and intelligent. However, cronyism and nepotism stand in the way of this simplicity. Cronyism and nepotism are the idea that people should not be rewarded based on their contribution to society, on their work and intelligence, but rather on who they know, who they're related to, who they're friends with, and what they think. A system where efforts and talent are less important than friendships, blood ties and blackmail. Though not diametrically opposed to meritocracy, it nonetheless interferes with it immensely, as you'd expect. When cronyism and nepotism reign, people quickly become less interested in working and learning, preferring to make the right friends and obtain embarrassing information on people with positions of power to use as blackmail against them. Furthermore, as time passes, those who refuse to participate in this obscene system find themselves destitute. Their hard work and their intelligence do not pay off. Instead, what they produce is stolen from them, often at gunpoint or at the implication of a gun pointing at them. Furthermore, even those who manage to both be hardworking and intelligent, yet also have the good friends and family ties quickly become disillusioned, realizing that they are sustaining a system of leeches. The eventual outcome of such a system is mere logic. You do not need to have the power of divination to see that it is unsustainable and thus will eventually collapse upon itself as production falls off while the population remains as large as ever. Just because people stop working does not mean that they no longer need to eat and remain safe, and having friends and family will not make that food and safety appear in front of you. Society is doomed. And this is my warning to all those who may read and who seek to sustain a system where anything but merit is rewarded, you are working against yourselves. Anything you do to delay the collapse of that system will merely be a sacrifice of individuals and resources which will no longer be available to you when the inevitable happens and you need to rebuild. And you will run out of things and people to sacrifice eventually, make no mistake. And at that moment, you will face the abyss, and it will be too late. You will be swallowed up and out of the darkness you left behind. If there are any left, they will rise up and rebuild out of the rubble you left behind. It has happened before, and if you do not change your course, it will happen again. Understand this: no sustainable system can be anything but a meritocracy of some form. We might disagree on what merit might be, the specifics and the details. But the undeniable fact is that anything else is societal suicide in the long run, something which no one will profit from. Cronyism and nepotism are the death of human civilization.
Video 9, Quebec Separatism.
On Quebec separation. This topic may seem unusual compared to others I've covered, as I usually touch on fairly universal concepts. However, I want to speak of Quebec's separatist movement for two reasons. 1. Quebec's separation from Canada would have far-reaching consequences across the entire world, much more than most people would expect. 2. It concerns me personally as I am myself a Quebecer. I won't explain the history behind Quebec separatism, the pros and cons, its legitimacy, the cultural aspects of it, or anything you would know to make an informed decision on whether Quebec should separate from the rest of Canada or not. Instead, I will focus on two things: 1. Why it is inevitable. 2. Why it is important to the rest of the world. So first, why is Quebec separation inevitable? As explained previously, for a nation to function, it must have one common culture. It can have subcultures, but there cannot be two major cultural groups within it, or else issues arise surrounding the very laws of the nation. In Canada we have two major cultures. 1. The English-Canadian culture, which is composed of several very similar subcultures and is almost identical to the American culture. 2. The French-Canadian culture. We could also count the native cultures, yet their numbers are so small as to be unable to tip the balance. Though relevant, I'd rather stick to the topic at hand rather than explaining why I don't consider the native cultures of Canada to be major cultural groups. Anyway, the initial intent of the English conquerors back in the 18th century was to assimilate the Canadians and make them into proper English citizens. As can be seen today, these efforts have thoroughly failed in Quebec and continue to fail. And so we're left with two cultures which, though far from polarly opposed, are still too different to form one unified nation. However, Canada, instead of acting like a confederation of different nations, acts as if it is one nation, submitting the smaller culture, Quebec, to the larger one, Canada. As can be expected, this causes discontent, never mind tribalist attitudes from both sides. So, now that we have examined how Quebec will not be assimilated into the greater American culture surrounding it, one has to think about the future. No matter how powerful and prosperous a nation might be, it would be foolish to assume it will never face adversity. Now, imagine what would happen if a disparate nation like Canada were to face such adversity. Say, an invasion or a major catastrophe. The first thing that would happen is that the two cultures would turn away from each other and the separation of Quebec would happen, all naturally. And so, we can state that, unless things change and French Canadians somehow get assimilated into the greater American culture, Quebec's separation will inevitably happen if pressure is applied on Canada in one way or another. The only thing that's in question is how this separation will happen. Will it be through a democratic process, through a violent revolution, or through something even less predictable, such as a complete dismantling of Canada in the face of a catastrophe? No matter the way in which it happens, we can be assured that, if we wait until it happens on its own, the people of both Quebec and the rest of Canada will suffer immensely as the power structures disintegrate around them. But why does this matter so much? We're talking about one province of 8 million. Why would it affect the rest of the world? Well, there are several reasons, and none of them are pleasant to think about. First of all, one has to know that many of Canada's provinces have expressed a desire to join the United States of America if Quebec were to separate. Even without such explicit statements, it would appear as the eventual outcome. And even one province joins the United States, then it is only a matter of time until the rest follows. This would give the United States almost complete control of everything north of Mexico, including large portions of the Arctic. It would also give them access to Canada's resources, namely its freshwater, its iron, its gold and diamonds, its oil, its forests, the list goes on and on. I don't think I need to explain how certain rivals of the US would react if it gained access to all this. Yet if that was all, then Quebec's separation, though important, wouldn't affect the entire world. No, there's more. Second of all, we have to understand what Quebec's separation means to the rest of the world. This would send a message to many populations around the world, or one. It would confirm that it is indeed impossible for two different cultures to coexist within one nation governed by common laws. If even a peaceful, industrialized nation like Canada couldn't do it, what hopes do others have? 2. It is possible to achieve separation. These populations would then become very motivated to achieve the same. You could expect more separations to follow around the world, many through civil wars. And still, there are more reasons why this would affect the whole world. Third of all, you have to understand that the rest of Canada will not sit idly by and let it happen. During both referendums where Quebec citizens voted on whether they would leave Canada or not, the federal government was preparing an invasion of Quebec to secure and protect strategic facilities and resources in the eventuality of a victory of the separatists. This would mean civil war in Canada. Do you think the United States would sit idly by and let it happen? No, they would quickly get involved and attempt to pacify the region and forcefully annex Canada. However, this would also likely cause upheavals in the United States and likely trigger a second American Civil War. You can only imagine the impact this would have on the world. So, not only would the United States gain access to Canada's resources and territory as explained before, but it would be done in a way which would cause civil uprisings. And last but not least, we have to consider what Quebec's situation would be if it managed to gain its independence. We're talking about a territory several times larger than most European nations, peopled by only 8 million souls, loaded with resources of all kinds, and without an army. Unless Quebec were to find a way to convince the United States to defend it, which is unlikely to happen, if the rest of Canada joins the United States, then it will be very vulnerable to foreign invaders. If the United States act to defend Quebec from them, it will not be an act of friendship, but an act of self-defense, in which case they would immediately seize control of Quebec, with all the consequences explained earlier. And so, you now understand why Quebec's separation is inevitable and why it will have far-reaching repercussions around the world. At this point, instead of arguing about whether Quebec should separate or not, Canada should be preparing for it so it happens smoothly and with as few issues as possible. Otherwise, it will result in tremendous misery for all involved. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe.